So we have our alien chasing the player, but once they reach the player, nothing happens. So in this lesson, we're going to make it so when the AI is within range of the player, they will stop moving and start playing an attacking animation. So to start setting this up, we're going to head into our alien AI blueprint. We're going to create a new function, and this function is going to calculate if the alien is within an attack range of the player. So let's name this function is within attack range. We're going to make this function a pure const function, and to calculate if the alien is within an attack range, we're going to call an Unreal function named getDistance2. And this function simply returns the distance between two actors in Unreal units. Now remember, one Unreal unit is equal to 1 centimeter. So if this returns 100, this means that the distance is 1 meter. And we have two inputs on this function. The first target input is self, which means this blueprint. So we can compare the distance of this alien to another actor. Now I could go on and show you how to set up the rest of this function, but I want you to apply your knowledge and finish off setting the rest of this up. This function should return if the alien is within an attack range to the player. So get the distance of the alien to the player character, then check to see if the distance is less than an attack range. Now you won't have an attack range, but you can create one. Then return the result as a return value on the function. So pause here to set up this is within attack range function, and don't worry if you get stuck, we'll go through this once you come back and resume the lesson. Okay, so here's my is within attack range function. I've also created a float variable to use as the attack range. We get the distance of the alien to the player character. Then we compare the distance to see if it's less than the attack range by using our variable. Then we return the result of this comparison as a return value on this function. So I've set the default value of my attack range to be 150 units. So this is basically 1.5 meters. And it's important to note that when we get the distance of the alien to the player character, it chooses the alien's actor location, which is going to be the location of the root component. It's going to be right in the center of the capsule, basically where the arrow component appears from. So just keep this in mind when you choose your attack range. So let's come back to our event graph. We're going to call this function onTick. We're going to use a branch, connect this up to the tick, and we're going to use the function as the condition for the branch. So every frame we're going to check to see if the alien is close enough to attack the player. Now what happens if the alien is close enough? What are we going to do? Well, we're going to play an animation montage. Animation montages are an animation asset that we can create through the content browser. There's many different things we can do with them. They allow us to combine multiple animations together, they can loop sections of animations, they can trigger events at particular points in the animation, and more. But we're going to use animation montages at a very simple level. Animation montages are quite handy for us to use because they will allow us to trigger animations through Blueprint's code. Once we trigger an animation montage, it will play, but once it finishes, the character will automatically return back to playing the animations inside their animation blueprint. So we don't have to worry about setting up some code to play an animation and then adding some more code for once it finishes to go back to playing the animation blueprint again. The Anim Montage is going to handle all of this for us. So let's take a look at creating and setting up an animation montage. Let's come to the folder where we have all the animations for the spider that we're using for our alien. We actually already have an animation montage in our project set up. It's with the blue little thumbnail here, but let's ignore this for now. We have a few attack animations that we can use. We're going to take one of these attack animations and then create an animation montage from it. To do this, we can come back to the content browser, we can find the animation that we want to use, and we can right click on it and come up to create, and we can create an anim montage here. We can just name this Alien Attack 1. Now let's double click and open up the montage to take a look at it. Now there's not too much we need to worry about, it just looks like a regular animation, but there's a few things I want to point out. The montage shows us which animation is playing, and we can drag and drop animations here to make the montage play multiple animations at once, but we're going to just use a single animation for our montage. We can adjust the speed of the animation montage by changing the rate scale. The animation looks okay now, but we're going to want it a lot more faster paced. We want to make this a really quick swipe at the player, so we're going to increase this to 2.5. So it's a lot quicker now. And the final thing to take a look at is this little drop down here. Montages are assigned what's known as a slot. We can come up to Window and then open up the Anim Slot Manager. We only have one slot that's in a group that Unreal creates by default. And this is fine, we don't need to add any more slots or groups, but slots are used to organize our montages. And I just wanted to show you how to find the slot manager and how to create new slots and groups. But I haven't really explained what a slot is. A slot is something we can add into the anim graph of the animation blueprint to say where we want the montage to trigger. Let's come over to the animation blueprint. So by default, if we were to tell our alien AI to play a montage, nothing will actually happen because our animation blueprint isn't set up to play montages. This is where the slots come in. Our montage is assigned to a slot called default slot. We can right click and we can type in montage slot. And this shows us all of the slots that we can use, and we only have one here, so we can select the default slot. We can hook up the state machine into the slot, and then the slot will connect back to the final animation pose result. We can hit compile to get rid of the note. So by adding the slot to our anim graph, our animation blueprint will now listen out for and play any animation montages when requested. And this is all we need to do here. We can hit compile and save, then we can close the animation blueprint to come back to our alien AI blueprint. So how do we play an animation montage from blueprints? Well, it's quite simple. We can just right click and we can type in play montage, and we're going to get the one that's highlighted in green here, this play montage node. We can see it has many different output pins and input pins on this node. Now there's something we need to be aware of. We need to be aware of the way that we're setting up our code at the moment. We're calling our code on tick. So we can't just continuously execute this play montage on tick, because every frame the montage will just restart. So before we make our alien play the attack montage when they're in range, we first need to make sure that the alien is not already playing the attack montage. So it will only play the attack montage if it's not already playing. Okay, so to do this, we're going to create a new function. We're going to call this is attacking, and we're going to make it pure and const. This function is simply going to return if the alien is attacking or not. We need to start by asking if the animation blueprint is playing a montage. But how do we gain access to the animation blueprint? Well, first we need to grab the mesh component, because the animation blueprint is going to be associated with the mesh component. We can drag this out and reference the animation blueprint by calling the getAnimInstance function. We can think of this as getting the animation blueprint. Now with this, we can drag out the return value, and we can come to the montage category, and there's many functions here for dealing with montages. Now remember that the green F is for pure functions and the blue F is for impure functions. Now I want you to pause here and see if you can find a function that checks if a montage is playing. You want to check if the alien attack montage is playing, and we want our isAttacking function to output the result as a return value. So pause here to see if you can find the correct function to use and to finish setting up the rest of this function, and then we'll be ready to make the alien play the montage. Okay, so here is my isAttacking function. We get the mesh, we get the animation blueprint, and then we check to see if a montage is playing, and we can choose the montage here on the drop down. So we choose the alien attack 1, and then we take the result and make it a return value on our function. So this function now tells us if the alien is attacking or not. So now we can come back to our event graph, and we can call our isAttacking function. We can move the montage just further along here, and we can use a branch again. So we can say every frame, is the alien within the attack range to the player? If they are, then we can execute this branch with the condition of if the alien is attacking. Now, if the alien isn't attacking, we can then go ahead and then play the montage. And there's one thing I forgot here. We need to provide the skeletal mesh component for the montage. So we're just going to plug in our mesh component straight into this. And we also need to make sure that the montage that we play is our alien attack. Okay, we We can still clean this up, but let's just test it out for now. We can hit compile and save and come back to our level to test it out. So we can see that the alien moves towards us, and when it gets close, it starts playing the attack montage. And when the player moves away, it stops attacking and starts chasing the player. Now we'll add some code to stop the AI from moving when they attack, but first, let's come back to our blueprint to clean up our code. We say that if the alien is within the attack range, and if it's not attacking, we then play our animation montage. So it looks like we need both of these branches here, but actually we only need one. We can remove this second branch, we can bring the is attacking function back underneath this is within attack range function, and we can break the condition on the branch, we can drag out from the condition and type and. So we can say that if the alien is within the attack range, and if the alien is not attacking, how do we say not? Well, we can drag out from the return value, and we can just simply type in not and get the not boolean. And we can plug this straight into the second input on the and. So if the alien is within the attack range and if it's not attacking, then go ahead and then play our animation montage. So that cleans up our code, so we only have one branch, but what about deactivating the alien's movement when it goes to attack the player? Well, we can grab the character movement component and we can simply deactivate it when we go to attack the player. And then we can play the montage. But then once the montage has completed with this onComplete output pin, we can then get the character movement component again and then activate the movement. And if we want to, we can collapse these down into functions called deactivate AI movement and then also activate AI movement. Okay, so we deactivate and activate the AI movement when the alien attacks the player. So let's compile and save for the final time for this lesson, and let's come back and hit play. So the alien runs up to the player and it attacks, and if we move away, and we can see that he's no longer sliding and running after us while he's attacking. Now he looks like he's attacking us, but he's not causing any damage to the player. So in the next lesson, we're going to set it up so the alien can actually damage the player. Okay, so we want our alien AI to damage the player whenever the alien attacks. When the player gets damaged, we want the player's health to decrease, and once the health hits 0, the player should die. So to get started with this, let's enter the alien blueprint to create a new function called damage player. To cause damage to the player, we're going to make use of Unreal's damage system. We can bring up the action menu, and we can call the apply damage function. We can provide the actor that we want to damage. We want to damage the player character, so we're going to call get player character to use for the damaged actor. And we can provide the damage that we want to apply. We're going to right click on this pin to promote it to a variable called damage per hit. And we can hit compile to assign a default value. So every hit my alien does, I'm going to apply 15 damage, and we're promoting it to a variable so we can easily tune how much damage the alien does. So this is our function complete. It's very simple. We just call apply damage on the player character. But we want to call this function in the middle of our alien attack montage. To do this, we're going to make use of Anim Notifies. Anim Notifies are short for animation notifications. We can use Anim Notifies in both animations and animation montages. They allow us to execute events at particular points during an animation. So this can be used for things like footsteps. We can spawn sound effects or particle effects when a character's foot hits the ground, but they can also be used to execute our own code. We're going to create an Anim Notify inside our alien attack montage so we can execute the damage player function from our alien AI blueprint. So let's open up the alien attack montage. We want an event to execute whenever the alien is just at his full swipe. So we can pause the animation and we can scrub along on the animation timeline to where we want the attack to happen. We want it just to happen right around here. Now if we scroll down, we can find the Anim Notify section. To create a new Anim Notify, we can right click in the Notify section where we want to create a notify, and then we can come to Add Notify, then we can select New Notify to create a new one. Now we can name this, let's just name this Attack, And this is all we need to do here. We have the Anim Notify in our montage, and because we created the Anim Notify, we can now implement the event for it inside our animation blueprint. So let's come back to our animation blueprint, and let's switch over to the event graph. Now, in an empty space, we can bring up the action menu to search for the notify, which we called attack. So whenever the alien attack montage plays and hits our attack notify, this event will execute. Now this means that we can get our alien reference, and then we can call the damage player function we created inside the alien blueprint. So whenever the notify executes, we damage the player. And this is all we need to do here, so we can compile and save the animation blueprint and then close it. So the alien can damage the player, but this doesn't mean much yet because we haven't implemented the any damage event inside our marine blueprint. Whenever the marine receives damage, we need to subtract the marine's health by the amount of damage being applied. So let's come back to the content browser and let's open up the blueprints for the marine. Inside the events graph, let's come to an empty space, and we can implement the any damage event by right-clicking and typing and searching for event any damage. Now remember, our marine already has a variable for his health. It's under the player properties category. We can get the health, and then we can subtract it by the amount of damage being applied by calling the float subtract float node, and we can hook up the damage from the event into the input for this. So now whenever the marine gets damaged, we get his health and then subtract it by the amount of damage being applied. But we need to drag out the health again and select set this time, so we can set the health whenever the player receives damage with this new value. Now we probably want to clamp the player's health to a range, so the player's health can never go below 0. To do this, we can select the health variable, and then on the details panel, we can change the value range, so it goes between 0 and whatever we want the maximum health of the player to be. I'm just going to use 100. And I'm also going to set the default value for the health to be 100 as well. And we can hit compile. Awesome, so whenever the player receives damage now, we actually decrease the health and it will never go below 0. We can select all of this code here and we can collapse it down into a function called decrease health. And we can change the name of the input pin to damage amount. And let's enter this function and make the function also return the player's health. We can just move these nodes down, and then we can right click and add a return node. And we can use the output pin of the set health so we can return the health. And we can also rename this output pin to just simply health. So now if we hit compile and come back to the event graph, we can see that anytime we damage the player, we decrease the player's health, but we also get the new health on the end of this decrease health function. This is going to help us check if the player is dead. So to do this, we're going to create a new variable called dead, and this is going to store if the player is dead. We want to make sure that this is a boolean, and we can hit compile and make sure that the default value is definitely set to false. So whenever we start the game, the player is not dead. But we want to set this variable to true whenever the player's health is equal to 0. So we're going to drag out the health return value on our decrease health function. We're going to check to see if it's equal to 0. We can hold down B and left click to add a branch, and we can use our equal comparison here as the condition for the branch. Now we can grab our dead variable and set the player as dead from the true output of the branch. So whenever the player receives any damage, we decrease the player's health, we check to see if it's equal to 0, and if it is, we set that the player is dead. So this is good progress. You'll notice that the player's health bar will now decrease when the player is damaged, but once the player loses all of his health, nothing actually happens and we can still run around as usual. So we really need to make it more believable that the player has died. When the player is killed, we want to disable the player's movement. We want to disable the aiming and also disable the ability to fire the player's weapon. If the player dies while firing the weapon, we need to make sure that we stop the weapon from firing. And the final step to really make the player's death convincing is to make the Marine play a death animation. Now, in order to disable a lot of the player functions, we first want to check if the player is alive before we execute them. So if the player isn't alive, the functions won't execute. Now let's create a very simple function that returns if the player is alive. Let's create a new function inside our marine blueprint called isAlive. We're going to make it pure and const. Now this function is going to be really simple. We're going to make this function simply return if the player is not dead. We're going to grab our dead variable. We're going to drag it out and just type in not, and we're going to grab the not boolean function. Now we're going to add a return node and simply return if the player is not dead. And we can just make sure to hook up the execution pin here. So how does this help us? Well, if we come back to the event graph, we only want the player to be able to fire the weapon if the marine is alive. So let's enter this start firing weapon function. Let's move these nodes along inside the function. Now we can grab the function we just created that returns if the player is alive. We can use this with a branch, and we can execute the code that fires the weapon only if the player is alive. Now we don't need to do the same thing inside the stop firing weapon function, because if we did do the check and the player dies, then we wouldn't be able to stop the weapon from firing, it would be stuck firing. So we're actually going to call our stop firing weapon function when we know that the player has died. So we can just grab stop firing weapon and drag it out onto the graph and hook it up to the execution flow when the player dies. So now when the player runs out of health, we set them as dead and we stop firing their weapon. So this means that we've completed 2 of our objectives for making the player death appear more believable. Now I want you to disable the player movement and the aiming if the player is killed. So pause here and set up your code so you only allow your player to move and to aim if they are alive. Then once you've done this, come back and resume the lesson, then we'll take a look at setting up the death animation. Okay, so you should be checking now if the player is alive before we add any movement input. And where we go to update the player aim, we can enter this function, and we can simply check if the player is alive before we update the player aiming. Now let's come back to our level to test this out. The alien walks up to us, it decreases our health, and as soon as it hits 0, we shouldn't be able to move or aim. But as we can see, we can still aim and we can still move around, so something isn't working. So how can we debug this? Well, we know that the health is definitely decreasing because we see it decreasing on the health bar. So it's something to do after we decrease the health. Let's toggle a breakpoint where we set the player as dead. So this means if we come back to our level and hit play, Unreal should kick us out into the blueprint as soon as the player gets set as dead. And as we can see, this isn't happening, so it's actually before we set the player as dead. I think I know what it is. I think it's the health. If we drag this out and type toString, we can convert the float to a string, and then we can drag this out and call printString, so we can print the value of our health. This can be ugly for now, we'll remove it afterwards. We can come back to our level and hit play. I think the health isn't being clamped, so it keeps going down, and as soon as it hits 0, yep, it keeps going below 0. So the value range isn't actually working on our health variable. But this is okay, we can just manually clamp the health ourselves inside the decrease health function. Before we set the health and after we subtract it, we can just drag out from the subtraction node here and type in clamp and get the clamp float function. So we can clamp it between 0 and the maximum health of the player, which is going to be 100 for me. And we can hook this up into the set health node. So if we come back to the event graph, let's just make sure we've removed our breakpoint, which we have. So let's come back to the level and hit play now. So the alien comes towards us, reduces our health. As soon as it hits 0, we can no longer move or play. But as we can hear, we have this horrible rifle end sound spawning. So let's take a look at fixing this issue as well. This is happening because of our stop firing weapon function. We call this spawn sound 2D node to spawn the rifle end cue. But every time the alien attacks the player when the player is dead, we also call stop firing weapon. So this is why we keep hearing this sound. In order to fix this, we only want to call this spawn sound 2D node inside the stop firing weapon function whenever the player is alive. So we can use our function with a branch here again and just make sure that we execute this if the player is alive. And we still definitely want to call stop firing weapon whenever the player dies because we don't want the weapon to get stuck firing. So let's just try this again. So the alien comes towards the player, damages them, and then once the player's health reaches 0, the player can no longer move, aim, or fire, and we don't hear any of those annoying audio issues. Awesome, so the only thing missing now is the death animation, and I want you to try setting this up as the final challenge for this lesson. The Marine comes with his own death animation in the project, so inside your Marine animation blueprint, set up a state inside the state machine that plays the death animation. Then only enter this death state if the player is no longer alive. So you'll have to make use of the anim graph and the events graph to fully achieve this in your animation blueprint. But pause here and give this final challenge a go, and then we can wrap up this lesson. Okay, so well done if you got this working. Inside the animation blueprint for the Marine, within the events graph, we can grab our Marine reference, and we can either call our isAlive function or the dead variable that we have inside our Marine class. I'm going to call the variable. We can store this as a variable inside the animation blueprint so we can access it in the anim graph. Now once we store the variable, we can hook up the execution pin, then we can hit compile and then head into the state machine. And we can add one new state called def. Now we can enter the def state and we can play the def animation. And to enter the def states from the movement's blend space, we just need to set up this transition rule, which is going to be quite simple. We can just provide our dead variable here. So if the player is dead, then we can enter the def state. But if your variable returns if the player is alive, then this is fine too, but you would just have to make use of the not boolean function on this. So if the player is not alive, then you can enter the def state. But there's one final trick we're going to do with this. Inside the def state, we're going to select the animation, and we're going to make sure that it doesn't loop. We're going to turn off the loop animation checkbox here on the details panel. So this means if we come back to our level and hit play, the alien's going to damage us and eventually kill us, and the player goes into his death animation and it doesn't loop. So he just stays there dead. We can no longer move around, fire our weapon, or aim. Okay, great, so we've now completed all of these tasks to handle the player's death, and we've also crushed a couple of bugs as we set all of this up. So that wraps up this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to do the opposite and make it so the player can cause damage and kill the aliens with their weapon.